Just a second. So hello everybody, welcome to Radio Sophia. Radio Sophia is a virtual platform to host discussions and debates on socio-economic and political issues. It aims to bridge the gap between researchers in different fields of social sciences and management through mutual sharing of knowledge and experiences. It also aims to expose general public to academic debates. I am Kranti and I'll be the moderator for today's talk on the topic Secularism in Independent India. As we are going to celebrate 74th Independence Day on 15th August 2020, it's also important to understand the foundational aspects of the independent India's constitutions. And one such principle very much debated in the recent times is secularism. And today, to talk about this topic, how it is understood or how it is practiced in India since independence, I am honored to invite Professor G. Haragopal, who is a public intellectual, civil rights activist, and a distinguished scholar in social sciences. Any brief introduction about him will not do the justice to his work in academia and activism as a scholar activist. Nonetheless, I'll try to do my best in giving a quick picture. So Professor G. Haragopal was with the University of Hyderabad School of Social Sciences as a professor in the Department of Political Science and later in the Center of Human Rights, nurturing and guiding generations of students across different departments till his retirement. And he has also been a visiting professor at many prestigious institutions in India and abroad. And he's currently visiting professor at Bangalore NLSUI. So Professor Haragopal is very well-known civil rights and human rights activist who has been associated with various social movements such as Dalit movement, women movement, and labor movements for the last 4 decades. He participated in World Conference on Human Rights at Vienna on the invitation of the United Nations. He was a delegate of National Rights Program at Montreal, Canada, and he's also very well published in different books and journals. And I'm sure this is going to be a great talk for us. And Professor G. Haragopal, thank you very much for accepting our invitation at a very short notice. And the stage is all yours. So we can have a discussion for around a talk of 30-35 minutes and have questions, or we can do simultaneously as well, which is up to you.
Can I start?
Yes, sir. Please. Yeah.
Ms. Kranti and Radio Sophia friends, it's an opportunity to discuss on one of the challenges that independent India is facing right now. I would speak partly the conceptual dimension of secularism, and in terms of practice, what exactly is happening and how to go about. Basically, when I was to write a paper on secularism to a journal, I was trying to look at how liberalism defines secularism. Then I went to International Encyclopedia of Social Sciences, and to my surprise, there is no write-up on secularism in International Encyclopedia of Social Sciences. Equally surprisingly, I went to Marxist Dictionary of Thought, and there is no write-up on secularism, although that's an exhaustive account of the Marxist literature. So obviously neither Marxism nor liberalism have devoted any attention, nor they thought that it was worth listing either in the encyclopedia or in the Marxist dictionary. Now, if you look at evolution of the concept, Oxford Dictionary defines it as reducing the role of religion in public affairs and scientific temper. This is how Oxford Dictionary defines secularism. So in the absence of that, if you look at historical developments, we had for a very long time in human history, after the formation of the state, as you know, is institutionalized power. It has also a standing police, army, and all that, and the force is institutionalized. And in the liberal theory, If you go back to the origin of the state as the liberals interpreted, they said that in the state of nature there was insecurity and human beings, otherwise they enjoyed unrestrained freedom, but there was a insecurity. So human beings preferred life, security, bartering a part of their freedom. So that's how the state has come. But the origin of or the source of power was always considered is the God. If you read Romela, if you read R.S. Sharma, if you read Indian history, you find that the divine right theory, which was also true of the Europe, that divine right theory becomes very important, that the divine as the source of power. But as capitalism started developing from a feudal society, capitalist societies required reason, rationality, enlightenment, innovation, and they considered that religion as one of the constraints, and therefore they thought they wanted to reduce the role of religion, and gradually the market wanted a more scientific society or a more secular society. So therefore the separation of religion from the state power, and religion became more and more in the European societies more of an individual belief, personal practice, and in the public life role of religion gradually got reduced. In fact, when I went to Sweden, I suddenly saw a secular marriage hall. Then I asked them, what is secular marriage hall? Then they said that marriages performed in that hall are secular because they are not performed the marriage in the church. I mean, that's part of the civil societal development. But what I'm saying is that the state distanced itself from religion. And that developed as a concept of secularism, separating state from the religion. Now, as far as India is concerned, to cut short the story, we have borrowed several values from the Western culture, some of the democratic values, starting from Spartacus, French Revolution, American Civil War, Dutch. You have several, people's upsurge in the course of history, and we have borrowed, and they have bequeathed certain, very humane values. Civilization developed certain values, and secularism is a product of that long evolution of human society, and therefore Indian freedom struggle obviously was emphasizing on some of these values, and particularly when we come to India, it's a highly heterogeneous society. It has several religions, several languages, several communities, castes, cultures, ways of life, and in a highly heterogeneous, diverse, pluralistic society, obviously you can't have a state based on religion. And of course, we had a tragic history of even partition. So during the partition, when Jinnah argued for the two-state theory, he argued on the basis of religion, whereas the Congress party has taken a stand that the nation should not be divided on the religious basis. But finally, British manipulated and Congress conceded, and we have two states, and Pakistan based on religion, and therefore it is an Islamic state. And India claimed that we will be secular because we have a high heterogeneous society, and therefore the secularism was not only a value, a very high, human value, but secularism is also a historic necessity. That's how in the Indian Constitution we find secularism in the preamble, and if you look at the fundamental rights, at least from Article 20, 21, if I remember correctly, of Article 26, 27, 28, all of them deal with religion, where minorities will have a lot of rights in practicing. Even in the preamble, we say that there will be freedom of faith, expression of faith, and practice of everybody their own religion. And this is how secular values have come. So secularism, in one sense, in a dominant discourse, secularism is defined as a distance from religion, and Sarvadharma Samabhava, that all religions will be treated equal with equal respect and equal, each religion will have equal space, and therefore Indian Constitution reasserted that will be a secular state. And when we come to the practice, and what is happening, how religion started entering into public life in a bigger way, particularly into politics, has something to do with the neoliberalism. And you find that from 1947 to I would say 80, in one form or the other, religion somehow, there were certain practices, and we clearly, state also did not know. For example, giving certain extra support to the minorities was considered as a part of a secular practice. If people have gone to Makkah, or see the government subsidized, it was not considered as a religious act. It was considered as a secular act, because minorities need greater security, greater protection. They should feel equal. So in other words, those who are weak, those who are minorities, how you take care of them also partly defines what secularism is all about. Because I'm raising this question because many people think that if you give any help to the minorities, it constitutes communalism or appeasement of the minorities and the neglect of the majority or looking down majority. These are all political rhetoric, but basically one of the parameters of secularism is that how you take care of the minorities. And because once you say all religions will be treated equal, then if one section is a very small number, then you also have to take care of them. So something like reservations. So when we talk of reservations, the upper strata after the Mandal, that the way the debates went on, that they started arguing that merit is very important, equal opportunities are very important, everybody should be treated equal. So in an inequitous society, in an unequal society, paying extra attention to the vulnerable, to the weaker, or to the voiceless is more an assertion of secular values rather than talking of secularism as equal, because when you are not equal, then the weaker requires extra support. And if the minute you give extra support, it's considered, is a later part of the discourse from 1980s. In 1980s, we borrowed from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And you find that 80 to 83, we started opening market. And very interestingly, we started opting for capitalist path of development. But as we started opting for capitalist path, which was not the case earlier, at least we thought, because preamble says we build a socialist society. We had a mixed economy. Mrs. Gandhi talked about the poverty, abolition of poverty, nationalization of banks, land reforms, monopoly, restrictive trade practice. Up to 1970s, the discourse was very economic. But same Mrs. Gandhi, who was talking about poverty in 1970-71, by the time she comes back second time after she got defeated, the second time in the 1980-81, she abandoned the rhetoric on the poverty and started talking of unity and integrity of India, Ekta and Akhandata. That was the rhetoric. But the religious forces, particularly Hindu conservative forces, particularly Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, always claim that it was a cultural organization. It had nothing to do with the politics. And the religion was not claimed. But you find, when you come by the 1980-81, gradually religion, particularly after the emergency 77 to 80. 77, when we had JP movement, I think the communal, or the Hindu conservative forces entered politics. And their influence in the political, in the public life, it started expanding. This happened from the 1977-78. In fact, the Janata Party collapsed on the dual membership, whether one can be member of RSS and also a member of the political party, and there was a lot of internal fabbles, and therefore squabbles, and it collapsed. But 1980 to 83 Rath Yatra, and the borrowing a global capital, you find certain interrelation. One may not be able to establish one-to-one relation, but one reads history and the historical processes. You find by 1980s, the right-wing politics are right-wing politics started becoming important. And in other words, by the time we borrowed and clearly decided we'll go on a capitalist path of development, while in Europe, capitalist path of development separated religion, reduced the role of religion. In India, in contrast, as we started abandoning our socialist path, mixed economy and all that, and started opting for the capitalist path of development, so-called capitalist path of development, you find that the religion started becoming important in politics, and particularly Hindu symbols. Another thing that happened by 1970-71, because Indian economy was not doing well, it was only 2.5% rate of growth, and you find that people, different groups, because it's a highly heterogeneous society, so they started claiming what exactly is their legitimate share in the limited wealth of India, and that led to identity politics. So there are a large number of identity politics within India, and therefore Hindu identity also started becoming, and Hindu identity was superimposed on the multiple identities which were struggling for economic share, political share in the political power. But then politics of India shift from economics and from real economic needs and economic issues to culture. And culture influence practices, religious rituals, religious beliefs. When people and we always thought that the culture is autonomous, and cultural life is people live their own choice of life. But that life, that ritual, that belief system, that practices, religious practices, all of them started getting politicized. And obviously, Hindus constitute, Hindu means, who is Hindu? I mean, that itself used to be debated. Of course, my friend Kanchayala said that I'm not a Hindu. So the debate started picking up the whole thing. And therefore, gradually, when religion entered the politics, and the political parties, particularly Bharatiya Janata Party, started using religious symbols, and Ram became one of the important symbols in politics. And really, Ram represents a different value system, and there are different interpretations of Ram. But Ram became one of the important, political weapons in the hands of a particular political party, and they started using it. People started responding. That's where all of us are puzzled that how come that the people are responding their cultural belief, their ways of life, their styles, which were always considered beyond, politics and beyond, the political power, started responding. I think that's where we drifted, I would say, from the constitutional mandate, because Constitution says India will be secular India. Now the question one has to ask is that gradually the anti-secular forces or communal forces or communalism was no longer considered as communalism, because they thought that secularism, those who plead for secularism or talk about secularism are pseudo-secular, because their argument is that if you are a secular, you should treat a Hindu and a Muslim equal. Why there are special rights to the Muslims? Or why, special, attention to minority? What about the majority community? So, obviously the political discourse started changing, and the majority started saying that we are discriminated. That discrimination is, it's not discrimination, it is extra, attention that the state played to the minorities, because secularism, the content of secularism is that they're taking care of those who are minority. But once you pay special attention to minority, the majority are saying that we have been discriminated because we are paying special attention to them. So this, nobody, the political parties were not able to explain properly to the people that why, minority, because, the large majority, about 20 crores of Muslims after the partition of now 20 crores, at that time maybe 5-6 crores, all of them didn't go to Pakistan, although Pakistan declared itself as Islamic State. Because India was secular and they lived in India for centuries and lived in harmony, although there were certain communal tension, but by and large people lived together. And after the Muslim rule during the colonial period, you find that people started. I am in my own village. There is a 1/5 of population, the Muslim population. We never knew that they were quite different and all that. Muharram, we thought that was our own festival. We used to go when the peers, were taken in procession as children. We used to go. There used to be sweets in my house. We never thought that their religion is different, or that Muharram is different. And about 20-25 years back, 30 years back, when I went to a village to do a survey, I was trying to find out who are the poorest of the poor in the village. So we asked the Dalit, because that is being the poorer sections relatively more deprived. And we said, please identify the poorest of the poor in your village. And they debated for some time and identified 5 families. And they have taken me and then showed a house and say, sir, these are the very poor. Sometimes they go without food and all that. They don't get work. They are suffering a lot. And that was a Muslim family. So in the village, it was the poverty which, was seen as an identity rather than the religion. And my own father was very religious, for that matter. He was very religious. Hours together he used to spend in my house, worshipping and all that. But he was of my village so much that the Muslims of my village were very fond of my father. So religion of that kind, which is spiritual, is different from religion which talks about the differences, distances, appeasement. These two things are different. So I am not saying that anti-religion is secularism. I have not taken that position, although Marx talked about not only freedom of religion, but freedom from religion. I am not going that far. Secularism would not define freedom from religion. Secularism defines freedom of religion. So everybody should have a freedom to practice, to believe, to the religion, the ways of life, the belief systems in which they think is a very important, or they think they are close to their heart. So what has happened that in the politics, as there were growing inequalities because of the neoliberalism, market forces acquired enormous strength, and with the global capital, corporate capital, having an excess, it became a very powerful force, and then they occupied the media. Until then, the media was only Prasar Bharati and all that, but the media expanded phenomenally in 1990s, the 21st century. Of course, you find that so many channels, 24/7 of hours of media and all that, enormously expanded. But if you look at media and analyze the media is doesn't have that secular culture, secular character. Media also has become a part of the whole communal debate. And went on having a nexus. So that nexus of media is a nexus of the capital, the corporate capital. So because it represents the corporate capital, it represents the corporate interests. And corporate interests are not to see that people don't raise economic questions, so let them get lost in the cultural quagmire. And therefore they left the whole thing to the culture. And the culture became political. And they started politicizing the culture. And in the process, because it is a highly heterogeneous society, that's one problem. And secondly, the growing inequalities have led to this division in the society. So society started getting fragmented. But we started talking in terms of a secular, when we started talking in terms of the economic development, growth, the very fast growth, rate of growth, 10% rate of growth, superpower, 5 trillion economy. This is the economic language. But welfareism, distribution of the property, distribution of the wealth, more equitable society, more egalitarianism, that disappeared. So once egalitarianism disappeared from the politics as an important concern, in the place of egalitarianism came communalism. This is what happened. Now, I would therefore argue that as far as India's experiment is concerned, post-independent India, that secular experiment was missing in form. It became, but it was missing in somewhere content, because we thought that the state should maintain distance. That's only one way of looking at secularism. But society as such, which otherwise was, harmonious and all that, gradually the divisions were there, because the caste hierarchy is there, multi-religious society, and all these identities are readily available. Once they got politicized, so vulnerable, so I'm so amazed that they are so vulnerable that they started, in fact, the communal politics started attracting them very easily. Not much of, because there was Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, very well organized. They run 25,000 schools and all that. They were there as a big force. And added to that force, they entered Bharatiya Janata Party, started playing an important role in the political space. And the electoral politics shifted from the welfareism, egalitarianism, distribution, distributional justice and all that. And now you find that the political rhetoric changed. Now, therefore, I would argue that secularism not only should be defined in terms of distance between religion and the state, and state maintaining equidistance with religion. That may be secular state. But I will come back to another argument, maybe another 5-10 minutes, and then we can go for debate. What is a secular society? What is the secular economy? What is a secular society? Apart from what is a secular state? Secularization of economy, when we use the word secularization of economy, equitable development, the regional inequalities, when we invited a scholar to give a memorial lecture in Professor Ram Reddy, in fact, he talked about secular development. And that was the time when there was the Telangana movement, the regional movement was there. And he said secularization of development is equitable development of all regions. It is a better distribution. The secularism in economy is a better distribution of resources, better, greater claim on the growing resources by all sections of the society, more by the vulnerable sections. That is the secular economy. And what is a secular society? Now, in a secular society, I defined in my paper, which I wrote maybe about 10-15 years back, that I said the secular is, if I am a secular human being, the secular state, for a minute, let's keep it aside. Supposing I say that I am a secular human being, then what are the parameters? And how do you define a secular human being? Now, I would say that secular human being is he or she who enters into relationship with other human beings at an equal level without category rupturing the relationship. Be it caste, the caste is there, but the caste should not lead to a situation where I discriminate human beings because they belong to a different caste, and I become so prejudiced and I become so narrow that in terms of my relation with other human beings, I bring all other considerations other than human. But I would say that human beings, the society should develop a culture where people enter into relationship with each other without bringing extraneous factors. We are human, basically, and all other labels, that are attached to us, all other identities that are attached to are external. But basically, what is the internal essence of the human being is that we are human. Our identity, basic identity, is that we are human, different from the other species. And this, factor that I'm human, I forget. I become, regional, I become religious, I become communal, I become a casteist, I become a number of other things other than human. So the minute I meet another human being, I don't meet another human being as human, but I start thinking that what is he? What is his caste? No, what is his community? What is his religion? Oh my God, oh, he's a Muslim. So then I say, no, I start, looking at him in a different way. Or if somebody says belongs to some other community or to some other region, I start discriminating. So discriminating human beings on the considerations other than the consideration of human, I think is gradually leading to communalization of relations. And in the process, Ajay Gudavarti has written, sectarianity develops a certain relation within itself, but it becomes sectarian. Secularism is a unifying force, in fact. But instead of unifying the people, the secularism has also led to it. Therefore, it's a fragmented secularism. So if you have a fragmented secularism, and the people are every day from morning to evening, in my everyday life, I go on discriminating people. I become so prejudiced that I no longer remain human. I am something else other than human. And therefore, that goes to a point of becoming violent, and that goes to the point of lynching, that goes to the point of process of dehumanization, and that leads to such a terrible violence in the society. So when you see the communal rights and all that, the prejudice that the people carry is carried in such a violent way that you don't mind if somebody is crying, and you don't become a human. When they say you are lynching, somebody is crying, somebody is suffering. That suffering does not create the invoke your human qualities, but the other than human, non-human qualities are operating. I mean that therefore I would say that if we are secular, then secularization of the relations or secular society is humanizing the society. It is a more and more humanization process. At that time, human. In fact, the human society is growing. We are not fully human. We are in the process of becoming fully human. And therefore, when we talk of human nature, Marx says naturalize the human and humanizing the nature. So human nature is the human in me has to be naturalized, and my nature should become humanized. I mean, this is the process that every human being has to pass through, and our education has not been able to do this. We have not been able to train our children in this broad, view of life, and giving them that, humanize them and make them fuller human beings. And then child will not discriminate other child on any other considerations other than that. I was reading a small episode. He was writing that he went to somebody's house and there was a girl, a 10 years girl, and I believe the girl started saying, I hate Muslims. But he asked that why? She said that I have been pushed by a boy. He said, who is that boy? Do you know that? She said, no. Then he said that, how do you know that he's a Muslim? He said, because he pushed me, he must be Muslim. So a stage has come where, you don't even try to know. Even a Hindu boy can do that. But the girl's attitude now is shaped in such a manner that her perception is that if somebody discriminates, he must be a Muslim. It has gone that far. And in the process, what has happened is all human relations are fractured, they are ruptured. This rupture has taken place because the deep-rooted problems of pride and prejudice are playing a very important role at this point of time in all human relations. So how to secularize the human being? Therefore, secularization is broadening the human being, becoming fuller human being. I think that this part of the definition of the secularism has been missing for some reason in our discourse. And therefore, I would say that secularism is both the secularism of state, as far as state is Sarvadharma Samabhava, and secularization of economy in more terms of equitable development, egalitarian development. And secularism is entering into relationship with other human beings at a human level. And today, all relations are ruptured, and people have become insecure. And majority community, they think majoritarian. Even taking Ram as a symbol, my family god is Ram. My father, we used to have big Ram, this one, and in our own small, temple, the religious room, we have a Ram, with Patabhishek and all that, and my father used to worship. And my father used to say Ram is a lover of peace, and he's stood for very high values. He respected the public opinion. He wanted to respect father. Therefore, Ram abandoned power. He never wanted power. Just because father promised, so he left to the forest. All that. That people talk about. Ram has different images. So Ram also is considered, even Gandhi used to, invoke the name of Ram, but his Ram was different from the Ram that today, is presented to all of us. So therefore, even interpretation of a religion and religious symbols and from the past, they have to be secularized. Those symbols have to be secularized in terms of the values or whatever we may call. And there are several other symbols. So is the case of the gender relations. So because Hindu religion, I know that how it's a discrimination from Manu downwards, what has happened, and that's why Dr. Ambedkar talked about revolution and counter-revolution. And when he talked of revolution and counter-revolution, in fact, he cautioned the nation that the Brahminical ideology is so powerful that if the Dalits and the marginalized sections assert, even assuming they perform a revolution, but the Brahminical forces are so powerful they can even perform a counter-revolution. He gives the example of Buddha. And Buddhism, he says, was a revolution, but the uprooting of Buddhism by the Brahminism is a counter-revolution. So he was very clear about the whole thing. I think what is happening right now in India, that there is a more consciousness. There is a more consciousness about the dignity and self-respect among the marginalized sections. But that dignity and self-respect leading to enrichment of secularism, it has led to the fragmentation. And today it led to the communalization of social relations, communalization of state, that this has happened. Now, how to retrieve the values? This one of the highest human value, which a past generation, past civilization left. How do you advance it further? And therefore, at least at our personal level, we have to fight with our own, because it's a prejudice society. We are also brought up under a lot of prejudices. So whether we can fight with our prejudice and can look at other human beings as human, I think that's how the society has to be secularized. And because all of us today do not know what role we can play, because the forces are very powerful, and we feel suddenly helpless. But what all I can do is that maybe I may not be able to fight these forces, but I will remain human. I'll remain secular. I will remain secular in my practices. That's the counter. And if we are talking, if we are interacting, if we are teaching, I think we have to humanize. And if we can do that, in one sense, we can advance the entire cause of secularism, and perhaps we can push secular value into a much higher realm if all of us have to I mean, I'm therefore very happy when Kranti mentioned about secularism. I very readily agreed, because it's a high time that we talk secularism in its comprehensive sense, secularism in its historical sense, secularism as a vision of a society. I think it's extremely important. I compliment Kranti for this initiative, and I thank her for giving me this opportunity to interact with you. We can now have some question answers, I think. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hargopal. It's been like such a refreshing talk, because here we hardly get to listen to these talks in a management school, because the discussion space is limited, and now I feel like as if I'm back to Hyderabad Central University, where we used to have this sort of discussions. And so now I open the floor for discussion. If anybody would like to ask a question, you can either type in the comment box, or you can even unmute your microphone and ask the question. You can raise the hand. You can either type in the chat box, or meanwhile, before we take the questions, I have one question myself, Professor. So now you were talking about Professor Kancha Ailaya also, and the book Why I'm Not a Hindu. So one phenomena that surprises me, and in fact a lot of people when we were discussing, is a lot of OBCs joining with the Bharatiya Janata Party, or most OBCs taking the identity of the Hindu, whereas Professor Kancha Ailaya says in the book clearly differentiates among the Shudra caste, differentiates within the OBCs, and shows why they are not Hindu. And so this political identity of Hinduism, of the OBCs joining in a political organization, how do we understand that phenomenon?
In fact, in 1990s, I have written an article, Brahminism versus Bahujanism, Rise of Hindu Fundamental. Are you able to hear, Kranti? Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh. So then in this paper, I have argued that each caste, as a part of a democratic process, started questioning the caste above, because we have a hierarchical structure. So every caste was questioning the dominance of the caste above, and in the process they organize it better. Every caste is today better organized than ever before, and in the process of consolidation of their own organization, they started dominating the caste below. They, instead of treating the caste as equal, because they are questioning the caste above and dominance, then they should not dominate. When you are asking for equality with the caste above, you should extend equality to the caste below. But instead of treating the caste as below equal, you started dominating the caste. So therefore, what is happening is, in India, on the one hand, the authoritarian forces are being released, because every community has become a little authoritarian. Democratic forces are being released because every caste is questioning another caste. The two things are happening simultaneously. The communal politics are located in this authoritarian culture, and the democratization process has taken a backseat. The OBCs, you find that in the Uttar Pradesh and North India and all that, as they consider Yadavas, the sections which got better organized and challenged the Brahminical forces, and they are very successful in questioning them. They raised the question, the type of question that Kancha Ailaya raised. He said, "I'm rejecting Brahminism, Hinduism also." I mean, that's the type of questions which have become important. But at the same time, we must realize that the OBCs who are questioning the caste above, which is a very democratic process, they are not, treating the caste below as with dignity and equality. With the result, their tendency seems to be more to identify the communal politics, which are authoritarian, than the OBC politics or the democratic politics or the other, democratic politics. So suddenly you find this particular section, which is a very important section of the society. And what the Bharatiya Janata Party has done is that as the OBCs started consolidating their dominance of caste below, they started mobilizing the caste below. What Amit Shah has done is that the most backward OBCs. So most backward OBCs started, feeling the pinch of their backward caste, above dominating them. So they suddenly find that here is a political force which is talking about them. So that's where Congress party, the other secular parties failed. Even the Mayawati was not able to address the question of the most backward OBCs. But she was co-opted, or she had an alliance with OBC, but not the most backward. Now, most backward OBCs are are with the other with the politics, which are not necessarily their politics, but for the time being they are participating, and then they're saying that is their identity. I mean, that's how they think that their identity finds an expression in the state power, and those who talked about them, are in the state power. And therefore, they are identifying with the state power and thinking that they have got a little bit of power. I think that is where I was saying that this segmented or sectarian secularism is that you have become secular because you are challenging the caste above, but you have not become secular in the sense that you are treating the caste below as equals. I think this is the process we are passing through, but this is a temporary phenomenon, because everybody soon will realize that everybody is losing the game. And the upper strata, 1% of the people who have amassed the wealth, 1% of people who have now monopolized the state power and culture, and they are using the complete culture. And it is this 1%, at the most, maybe 10% or 20% who benefited from the neoliberal economy, who control 73% of economy. They are the beneficiaries. 80% of people are the losers. But we failed to explain to the 80% that you are deprived, your share has declined in the whole economy. But instead of talking about their share, declining of their share in the economy, they are talking in terms of the cultural ascendancy. It's not the economic, equality. I think that is where India is struck. But I have a feeling that soon this phase will be passed, and soon the deprived sections, all deprived sections, will realize that they are completely losers in culture, in power, and in economy. I think that we are all waiting for that shift.
Right. Professor, there's one question from Himadri Chakravarti. He's asking, why is that when we talk of secularism, we only talk about the unequal treatment of minorities by majorities and not the other way around?
No, secularism, it's a language. It's a language. So when you talk of unequal treatment, is a different. The unequal treatment has to be conceptualized. So language is a carrier of a meanings. Language is a carrier of universality. So therefore, you are using secularism because anyway, as a value, it is there in the Constitution of India. As a value, it has been handed over to us by previous generations. And therefore, today we have to appropriate secularism. That unequal treatment we have to treat as a part, and therefore they say unequal treatment, if to be equal, it has to secularize. So it is not the problem of language, it's the problem of the content, it's the problem of the actual substantive meaning rather than the formal meaning of the word. So it says a concept. What is wrong if you use the concept instead of saying unequal treatment, because it doesn't carry unequal treatment, it becomes more abstract than perhaps a secularism. So therefore, always in the human communication, we use symbols, we use concepts. That's how we conceptualize our experience. And when you abstract your experience, it becomes a concept, and then it acquires a language. And therefore, I think secularism, perhaps at this point of time, is a language which we have to use, we have to appropriate. It belongs to us. It doesn't belong to the upper class and the upper capital. It belongs to the people. It belongs to the weaker sections. I think perhaps that's the way that we can, maybe if somebody can come out with a much better expression, that will be great breakthrough in the communication as far as the treatment of human beings between each human being is concerned. I think that will be a breakthrough if somebody can come with a better expression.
So another question, sir, from Venu Gopal. So he's saying since long time he has this question, that is, for one community an animal, cow, is sacred, and for the other community it can be edible. So like that, many other things and ideas may be there in the nature or society. then how can his communities live in peace and harmony with secular outlook at the same geographical space?
No, that's why, see, those who are treating the upper strata of the society, now in education, for example, from the school education to college education, that is started coming upper caste anyway on education. What education we are imparting? That's the question. For example, this engineering, medicine, professional courses, technical courses. What is the outlook we are giving? So they are all with this type of thing. And so therefore the cow as a symbol, yes, it has come to the from a Buddhism. Because the animal cattle was needed, and cattle was needed once human beings went for agriculture, from food gathering to agricultural production, and therefore the cow being one of the animals giving not only milk in the pastoral society, because pastoral societies depend more on the milk, and therefore they started looking at the animal in a much more respectable way. And hunting societies were slightly different. Ramayana is a completely built around hunting society. Mahabharata is built on the pastoral society. That's why you find Gograhana and in Mahabharata reference to cow. But why cow has become important in the economy is because of agriculture. But and therefore people looked at that cow is now symbolized in such a manner that cow becomes sacred, and cow becomes a divisive force. A cow which was otherwise a productive force becomes a divisive force, and somebody uses that symbol because it has comes. And we are not able to explain that cow is a secular, this one is a productive force. It is one of the important elements in the economy. Instead of explaining that, it becomes a religious, communal, sacred symbol. And then, that section of the society would not understand, because we failed in our education. We failed in the enlightenment mission. And we also, I would say that people like Nehru and all that, even if you read Discovery of India, Nehru was not radicalizing the symbols, but he was only saying these cultural symbols are very rich symbols and all that. That's the difference between Discovery of India and writings of Baba Saheb Ambedkar. So you can see the difference, because Baba Saheb looked at Indian culture critically. Nehru looked at the Indian culture in a more appreciative way, because he wanted to build nation state on a very cultural. So therefore he used borrowed all the cultural symbols which for him were progressive. But I think we failed to educate the society why cow has come to be considered as an important animal in our mythology or in our history. And therefore the minute you raise the question of cow, it becomes more a sensitive question than a historical question. I think that's very important to understand.
If there are any more questions, please continue to post. So meanwhile, I have one question. So now, as you're talking about how education failed to give this kind of idea, to sensitize our mind and broaden our mind to understand this concept. So I feel, so right from the schooling until we finish the post-graduation or even at the PhD level, so if I were not a part of a social sciences discipline, or a part of a larger university like University of Hyderabad, where there is an open discussion about these topics, I would never have even come across any of these ideas. So for me, religion would have just remained as an idea in practice that, okay, there are Muslims, there are Hindus, there are Christians, and that's it. And I would not probably understand. So, and now that I see one of the impact here is, at least in institutions like IIMs or IITs, etc., you do not talk about it. So there is no discussion. So in that process, what are the dangers? I feel there is no acknowledgement of the differences. Even in our classrooms where we have some courses like social structure, etc., people believe there is no more caste discrimination, there is no more religious discrimination existing. And they, students also do not wish to engage, or they feel it is very touchy topic, or anything to do with identity, they consider it as sensitive and try to stay away from it, to be politically correct. So what do you think are such dangers in this process, in this type of education?
No, this is what happened, Amma. See, we always thought culture should be left to the personal belief of the people. I mean, this is how we began. State should have nothing to do with religion. They should treat all religions equally. This is the, so in the process, we didn't bring the religion or culture into our education, even the type of education we receive. If at all we brought it, most of the textbooks, when I recall in 1950s when I was a high school student, if I recall the lessons we had, they were Brahminical. We didn't realize at that point of time, but they were Brahminical. And in the process, what happened, whatever Telugu literature, because that's where the culture figures in. Otherwise, in social sciences, hardly we taught anything about culture. I mean, when I started teaching political economy, then I started bringing cultural variable, and now we realize that how powerful the cultural factors are. Now we realize, but largely education system and particularly technical education. So where we are missing the point is that knowledge has to be reduced, can be reduced only into two dimensions. One knowledge is relation of human being with the nature. That's where IITs, they deal with that relation with the nature. What are the forces of nature? What are the productive forces? What is chemical? What is biology? What is genetics and all that? It's all productive forces. Other part of the knowledge is the relationship between human beings, right? And those who are dealing with the nature, analyzing the nature, have nothing to do with relations between human beings. Their social sciences, humanities deal with. And humanities and social sciences also, in a way, remained fragmented. And therefore, what has happened is, they thought science and technology, we have nothing to do with that. But as the knowledge grows in the technology, and how the technology can come back and impact on the social relations, and how social relations can also impact quality of research. If I'm a supervisor in a scientific lab, in a chemistry lab, if I treat my research scholar not only as a research scholar, but as the research scholar's caste, community, background, and all that, research will not progress. There will not be breakthrough in the knowledge system, because in the science, why you are getting not getting any Nobel Prize apart from the infrastructure and all that, your social relations in the laboratory are based on pride and prejudice. They are not based on this is my research scholar, my relation with the research scholar, and the growth of I am training a fine mind, and and my relation with the scholar is only at that level. It's a knowledge should mediate the relation between the supervisor and the scholar. Only knowledge should mediate. But what is happening in universities, that in the universities, the relation between student and teacher is not mediated through knowledge, through several other prejudices of the teacher, the way the teacher behaves. And a knowledgeable teacher is supposed to be the treats at least all his students as equals. And the way he interacts with the student should be at that level, but it is not happening. So all other relations have come into the knowledge system. So today knowledge is not secularized. So I think the institutions, and particularly technical institutions, because they don't deal with the relation between the human beings. So today you find that the science and technology institutions are easily vulnerable for communalism, because they have never reflected on those questions. They are scientists. They have to believe in reason, rationality. Galileo, Copernicus, Bruno, and they sacrificed their lives fighting the orthodoxy. Bruno was burnt alive. So Archimedes was killed by the soldiers. They don't read history of science. Today, the scientist stands on the shoulders of the scientists who faced the orthodoxy, and they were killed, they were tortured. But still, out of their sheer courage and conviction, they carried their research and they did not budge. And that's the reason today science advanced. But the scientists do not read this history. They think that all the science has come from in a smooth way. No. The Christian orthodoxy did play very havoc with the entire scientific and technological research. So I think what is very important is, once in the University of Hyderabad, my science friends always said, what is there in social science, the common sense, we don't need social sciences and all that. So because I was the dean of the School of Social Science, I used to find some of the faculty talking, and then I told the Vice Chancellor that I want to give a lecture on social sciences to the Academic Council. So Vice Chancellor gave me 45 minutes, and I had to give a lecture on social sciences in the role of the social science in the knowledge system. And then, of course, mathematics professors and chemistry professors, oh, we never knew this, nobody told us, oh, this very enlightening, very.
So I think there are no more questions, and we're also running out of time, so we can end the session. And thank you very, very much for agreeing to talk on this, sir. And this talk will be available online. It will be uploaded to the Radio Sophia YouTube channel. And I hope many more students will be able to access it from there. And it has been a great pleasure to host you. This is the second time I'm hosting a talk with you. Once it was back then in HCU when I was an integrated student, and now I'm a PhD student. And so even that was on the occasion of Independence Day. And now we are nearing another Independence Day, and some things have changed and some things have not. So I think there's a long way for all of us to go, and really appreciate your efforts to be here today on a Monday morning and give us this lecture. It has been very insightful. So, yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kranti. Thank you very much for this interaction. Huh? Thank
Yes,
you.
Thank you, sir.